wanted people to be able to go and see them for themselves. And I think that's really important because they're there as physical symbols and they're easily accessible. I mean, you only have to go as far as, well, there's lots in London, but there, you only have to go as far as the Isle of Wight or Edinburgh, nowhere further than that to see this evidence. So that's why I focused in those periods. And also because I wanted to be able to draw on historical archives, including newspapers and so on. And that's much harder if we're going back to pre-modern. But I definitely think it's a rich, rich area. And I think there's a lot more to be written. I hope that for some people, this is an inspiration to say, let's go further and let's look deeper and let's go before Elizabethan England. It would be really interesting to read about that.
What surprises me, some of the monarchs, like you said, who built the mosque in Kew Gardens.
Yeah.
Or Queen Victoria, who had Munshi Abdul Karim, who looked after him well and then learned Urdu and whatever. It seems they have broken off from the elites of those times and done something quite unusual. Is there any inkling of why this could have happened?
So I think that's something that I try to reflect on in the book, and I don't necessarily have the answers. I talk about constant tension between curiosity and conquest. So you have this period in which elite Britain in particular, and you're right, it's led by royals and nobility, are fascinated by the Orient. They want to learn the languages, they want to emulate the architecture, they're fascinated. There's still bigotry towards Islam religiously, but they're fascinated by the peoples and the cultures. Then that changes, and I think that partly changes because Britain develops an empire of its own and goes from saying, we want to be like the Ottoman Empire, we want to be like these other superpowers, to saying they should be more like us. But in that whole process, us is only formed because of all of these exchanges. And so one of the things I say is it's not easy to separate out what is Britain. If you look at architecture, for instance, if you look at St Pancras or Paddington Station, there's elements of Moorish architecture prevalent. So it's not easy to separate out what is Britain. And then I talk about the sort of curiosity and conquest. So you've got the curiosity, but at the same time, there's a desire to conquest these lands. And again, it's not easy to separate out these two things. So it's not just a happy story of curiosity and we want to bring mosques to Britain. It's never that straightforward. It's done as a desire to emulate power, perhaps. And then once the British Empire has power, there's a feeling among certain elites to say, well, we're the civilized ones, they should be more like us. But one of the things I'm trying to question, and the undertone of the book is to start asking, what does it mean to be civilized? And who has given whom civilization? And that's something that I want, particularly our younger generation, to walk around with the confidence to say, well, here are the things that have formed Britain. Here is what my civilization, my background, my religion, my culture has given you. And I think that's a very different starting point to a model in which you're told, this is Britain and you must come and integrate into Britain. And that's something I want to challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to note that the live stream went down for a couple of minutes, but it's back up again.
Hello, thank you for your talk. It's very informative, very well written book.
Thank you.
I'm just saying, with your book, will you be making it into a TV series? It's more easier for people.
Would you like to see one?
Yeah.
Maybe you should write into certain broadcasters and ask them to see it.
Oh, really?
That would be very helpful.
Yeah, it's more easy to see in episode 1 and to read. I'm not very good at book
I agree.
reading.
Yeah, there I agree. Watch this space. We'll see.
Yeah, and also you're saying the first mosque was built in Kew Gardens. I don't think many people knew this thing. But how many mosques do you think there are now? Because lately there was a mosque in Cambridge that's just built, isn't it? It's a big, huge mansion apparently, millions of pounds.
Yeah.
How many mosques are there built today?
Built recently, or how many mosques exist
How many mosques
in
are there
total?
within the UK nowadays?
I mean, I guess there's hundreds. I haven't calculated. Maybe Miqdad can give you an answer on that one, actually. Hundreds, I would say, possibly. But one of the things that I talk about in that chapter, so as I say, I tell the history of the Kew Gardens Mosque, but then I also went to visit Lincoln, where they were trying to build a mosque and they faced EDL marches and the far right turning up to town, and I talk about some of the challenges that they faced, and these are challenges that Muslims in cities and towns across the country faced. I just gave one example of a community trying to build a mosque, because I think it's important that these aren't just nice stories. We should reflect on the reality for mosque building today, for instance.
Do they pay tax when they build the mosque to the government or anything like this Cambridge mosque?
I'm afraid I don't know that information. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I've been really enjoying reading the book so far.
Oh, I'm very glad. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, because especially when we look at sort of the Tudor times, actually some of those interactions are sort of very tokenistic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you mentioned about we don't get taught about that bit of Elizabethan history at school, but politically had very little effect. It really is kind of a footnote in history. And there's been a lot, not just yourself, but there's been a lot more sort of coverage of trying to dig out these sort of links between Islam and Tudor times and ahead. And as I say, the fact that the Moroccan ambassador came in the sort of 15 or the 1600s even, it's not hugely significant. And I wonder if actually, these small things and the fact that we're digging so much about them says more about us now than actually what was truly happening on the ground during Tudor times.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually. For me, it's about the starting point. Why are we digging these stories out? I don't think we should be digging these stories out because we are so desperate to find our place in Britain, and so we have to use the fact that the Moroccan ambassador arrived in exchange with Elizabeth I as sort of evidence to say, well, because of that, I belong in Britain. I mean, if it has that effect for some people, I think that's a useful thing. But I don't think that should be our starting point. And that's not the impression that I would want to give. I think it's about, well, first of all, it's about disrupting monolithic history. And yes, you're right. Okay, perhaps the Moroccan ambassador's visit isn't as significant as Henry VIII's break away from the Catholic Church in terms of the trajectory for Britain. But I would argue that those exchanges are significant in their own way because they build up to something. So were it not for Elizabeth I seeking those alliances, the East India Company would never have been formed, initially formed as a trading company to the Ottoman Empire. And were the East India Company not formed, we would not have the British Empire in India. And if we did not have the British Empire in India, we wouldn't have the modern day immigration that we have had to Britain today. So I think there was a sort of knock-on effect, and I try to trace some of those threads through the book. So in that sense, I would argue that they do have significance. But you're right, we shouldn't be seeking out these stories as a way to find legitimacy or prove our place in Britain. That's not the idea. Does that answer, is that what you were getting at? Yeah? I think this is something we should be very conscious of in general, not just my book, but others. As you say, there are other stories seeking out Black history or Muslim history. It shouldn't be done starting from a place of inferiority and trying to prove something.
David?
I'd like to buy your book, but I'm terrified it might have sold out by now. Is it still?
I think there might be a few copies.
I'd like to ask a question about the National Trust.
Uh-huh.
I wonder if you could comment on the current efforts of the National Trust to come to terms with the history.
So that's a really good question, and it's something that's come up at quite a few events I've done, actually. And I've spoken at Cheltenham Literature Festival alongside someone from the National Trust who was able to share with me some of their feelings and thoughts and what's going on there. I think one of the things that's happened in that whole debate around the National Trust, so I mean, I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but I should probably say the National Trust is one of the organisations that has decided to relook at its collections, to think about how it labels them. They started off saying they wanted to acknowledge the role of slavery in many of their country homes, but they are looking more widely than that in terms of the role of empire. And there's some really interesting work going on where they're just trying to improve signs or tell more interesting stories and do it in a very thoughtful, very historically grounded way. But unfortunately, some newspapers have taken that project and process and decided to turn it into something that should be sort of polemic debate. And it's become an incredibly heated and political debate, accusations that people are trying to rewrite history, sort of questioning as to who should be allowed to tell history. Apart from the National Trust, we've also seen debates about statues, heated debates about statues and whether they should come down or they should stay up, or whether objects should stay in place or be removed. One of the frustrations for me, I started writing this book in late 2016, and a lot has happened since then. But one of the frustrations for me in more recent years has been the kind of heat around these debates, the sort of anger that hasn't allowed us to actually shed light on the reality of these historical interactions. And I think first and foremost, that's the most important thing. And so from my understanding and the conversations I've had with the National Trust is they are just trying to do that. And apart from the kind of very angry pushback they've also had lots and lots of positive comments. They've had lots of people join up as members, go and visit their sites. And I know that they really appreciate hearing from people who seek out a more diverse, a wider, a more honest history. And I think that that's the process that they're trying to engage in from everything I understand. But I think that the lesson for those of us who want to hear those stories is that perhaps we need to be as loud as some of the others. And that would help.
Kasia.
Thanks for your talk. My question follows on from the last points you were making. So one is anger so bad necessarily? Like, is it always necessarily a negative thing when it comes to statues or other things? And in relation to the things, like the objects that you were seeking out, like those that were stolen, like do you think that they should be returned? Mm-hmm. Or is that part of being angry?
Anger is not bad. Sometimes I get angry. There are members of my family who can attest to that here tonight. I just think it's not the only emotion we should use. When we're talking about statues or history or anything politically, I think it's quite important that there are going to be different groups of people that you have to try and engage. And sometimes you have to be angry as a way to get something on the agenda. So for instance, people would argue, unless they're talking about tearing down a statue, it doesn't get the coverage. It doesn't get the debate it deserves. The famous statue in Bristol that was torn down in 2020, for a long time there had been a campaign to put up a sign. No one was listening. It's only when the statue was torn down that we were all then talking about it. So yes, anger definitely has its place. But I also think it's quite important to take people along the journey with you. And if all we're doing is raging, that's not going to happen. And so there has to be a process in which I think you can say, okay, let's step away from the heat of a debate and let's just talk about historical facts. This happened. These are true stories. They're taken from British sources, from British archives. They're sitting in British museums. You can see them for yourself. And also, you might have a nice day out when you see them. And I think that allows you to take a broader range of people with you. And I've certainly found it interesting, the process of meeting some readers, because people come at it from very different places, that I have met some people who say that it changed their minds on something, that they came at it from a different place, of believing that there was a process to rewrite history, and not just my book, but other things also allowed them to see that there was a different way of looking at it, and it's not just a question of tear everything down, send it all back. So that's why I'm saying we need to move on from just anger. But of course, there's a place for anger, and some people need to be angry, and some people need to be sort of calm and reflective. I think everyone plays a different role in society and in conversations around history. As for your question about stolen objects, most of the objects in this book are not stolen. In fact, Chapter 3, Tipu Sultan chapter, is the one where objects are stolen. The rest are either inspired by or arrived here through legitimate means. Now, I think it's very hard to talk about it in blanket terms, because there's a whole process of who should have an object, and sometimes there's multiple claims. So, for instance, you have India, Pakistan, Afghanistan all saying that the Kohinoor belongs to them, as an example. Who should that go back to? How should it go back? Of course, some objects should be sent back. Of course, this is a conversation we should be having, but I think it depends on the object and the particular debate and who is asking for it. That's my very sitting on the fence answer for that one.
Thank you so much for that. And I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but it sounds
That's
fascinating.
okay, I forgive you.
So from what I've heard today, it sounds like one of the key kind of turning points was the rejection of the Catholic world, and then Britain or England looked outwards and started building these relationships. So do you think after the rejection of Europe and Brexit, there's a similar opportunity to, or do you think it's more inward looking?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And it's very perceptive of you to pick up on that. That's exactly one of the things that I say in the book. So we are at a crossroads. Yes, Britain has chosen to reject the European Union, to be clear, not Europe, the European Union. You can be for or against that. I'm not going to give you a position. And it does mean that there is apparently an opportunity to forge new relationships and think about Britain's place in the world. Again, you can be skeptical of that. But I do think that's a good moment to remind people of some of the history that they may not know about as a way to think differently about Britain's future. Now, whether or not that's going to be a call taken up by our politicians, from both major parties, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to do that. I think they're currently failing us, and I think it's on us to start making demands to say, well, here are some facts about history. Here are alternative or ways of looking at things, and perhaps we could forge a different future based on them. And perhaps we could identify pitfalls in history that we could avoid again. So yeah, I think it is a really interesting moment. The other way that that Brexit comes up in the book is in the chapter about Elizabethan England. I also examine the kind of, at the same time as Elizabeth is forging these links with the Ottoman Empire, among in popular culture, there's a raging fear of the Turk. And one of the things that happens is coffee is brought from the Ottoman Empire into England, and coffee houses are set up, and they become threats to traditional ale houses. And so as a result, there's a campaign against coffee, and it's described as a dirty, muddy puddle water. And you have these petitions apparently written by women that say that the Turkish drink is an enchantress taking their husbands away. So there's quite an interesting moment where the Turk is vilified. And for me, there was an interesting parallel, regardless of your view on whether we should remain or leave in the European Union. There was an interesting parallel with the 2016 campaign to leave. Many of you will remember there was a huge poster that said, Turkey population, whatever the claimed population was, is joining the EU, and this is a reason why we should leave. And so I look at whether this fear of the Turk is just something that we've continued to or not we, but British society has continued to play on as a way of examining something currently politically. We can trace back this fear historically. So yes, in answer to your question, I definitely think there are parallels, and it's an interesting moment. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. We'll end there. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.